From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Few things conjure the idea of the American South more than the magazine Southern Living. First published in 1966 and still operating today, Southern Living was a resounding success. By 1980, just 14 years after its debut, annual circulation numbers were about 2 million. By 2010, it was hitting 4 million subscribers. Southern Living did important work for helping shape the identity of the South, especially when it came to helping define the taste of the South. It was full of recipes, suggesting what was genuine Southern cuisine and what the true taste of the South was. To help us navigate this fascinating topic and fully unpack the changing tastes of the South in Southern Living, we have with us today a freshly minted BA, a 2023 graduate of the University of South Carolina, Emily Ames. Welcome to Take on the South, Emily.
Thank you.
Emily, before we get into your thesis, because this is what you wrote about, can you just tell us where you're from? Are you a Southerner? From whence do you hail? What was your BA in?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, right outside the city, and lived there for 18 years, decided to come to USC for my undergrad, spent 4 years studying history. I have a minor in anthropology, and yeah.
So Baltimore. Do
Yes.
you think it's part of the South?
No, I don't.
Why not?
That's a hard question to answer. I will say there are parts of Maryland that feel like the South. If you go to Western Maryland, it has a little bit of an Appalachian feel. If you go to the Eastern Shore, which is what we call the area that's east of the Bay Bridge.
Right. It's crab country, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That has a little bit of a Southern feel as well. But Baltimore itself is kind of a weird in-between. I would say it's more of just its own thing.
Yeah, because it's urban.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Liminal space for a
Right.
Southerner. All right. So you wrote what I think is a really interesting and beautifully executed senior thesis.
Thank you.
And I was honored to direct this. And you came to me with this topic, and you'd spoken with Matt about this and a few other people, and it seems like a really good idea. Southern living, like the quintessential Southern expression of what it means to be Southern. Could you just tell us in broad terms what you were trying to do in your senior thesis?
Yeah. So I knew that I wanted to write my thesis about the South. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do contemporary South or something a little bit less modern. But once I settled on Southern living, I think that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the South is perceived, because much of what we construe to be the South is constructed through media. And this magazine especially contributes to that. So yeah, I mean, once I started looking through the magazines, I realized it would probably be a little bit too much of a task to do the entire magazine, so started focusing on food. And from there, kind of just constructed a thesis about, how Southerners view themselves through their food and how the rest of the country and the rest of the world views the South through food.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting platform from which to view how Southerners see themselves. You are what you eat, right? But also how they're representing themselves to the outside world, to people not from the South perhaps, and to an international readership. I mean, this is a big magazine, right?
Right.
And it starts, in 66? And so can you just take us through what your parameters were?
Yeah, so since it started in 66, I decided to do one 1 year for every 10 years. So started in 67, did 67, 77, 87, 97, 2007, and 2017.
So this is a long arc, right?
Correct.
So you're taking a year for every decade, and you're reading thoroughly the entire year's worth of magazines. How many pages does that come to roughly? Do you know? It's a lot.
It was a lot. It was a lot. I think once I got to like 87, started to kind of get a system down where I was able to just look at the recipes.
Yep.
Before that, I was flipping through every single page of the magazine. It was taking a really long time, but.
Yeah. So we have a nice long arc. You're focusing on 1 year, and we don't know if it's representative, but on the whole, it probably is. So you're looking for the recipes. Can you tell us a bit though about what's in Southern Living generally? Like, what else do you find? What are they trying to sell here?
So most of the magazines have, I think, 4 sections. I want to say there's a travel section, like travel and leisure, which usually consists of places in the South that they're trying to get people to visit. So it's a very touristy approach.
To bring people in.
Correct.
Right.
And then they also have a home and garden section. So, they'll tell you which plants to put in your garden to make it look good.
What time of year.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's the food section. And then I'm missing one. I can't really remember. It might really only be the 3. Then there's just some fluff in there.
Sort of packaging and what have you. So in the food section, it's made up of what? Like recipes that people have sent in, or Southern Living editors? And let's back up a second. Who's publishing this magazine?
So the magazine is published out of Birmingham, Alabama, until I believe the 80s, when it's sold to a New York conglomerate, which is Times Inc.
Okay. So it's exclusively a Southern publisher until the 80s, and then it becomes part of a multinational.
Right.
Okay. We'll talk about that in a bit, because I'm curious to see if that had any impact. Right? I mean, it's hard to tell, but so you zero in on the food section of Southern Living. And those are recipes, and they're sent in by people or generated?
So there's a few, I'd say in each monthly issue, there's like 2 special, I kind of called them articles in my thesis. I wasn't really sure what else to describe them as. For example, there was one, I think, on barbecue. Yep. And so they do like a whole introduction about it. They write a little bit about it, and then they have some recipes. For the most part, it'll just be a collection of recipes, and those recipes are sent in by readers. Okay. And so they list the reader's name and where they're from. Mostly, you can't tell the recipe contributor's race or ethnicity, obviously, from just their name and where they're from, but for the most part, they're women and they're from the South.
Okay. So this is a really good basis for kind of figuring out what Southerners think of as Southern food, and obviously, since they're being published in Southern Living is advertising these things as Southern food. All right, so let's take us through the decades, Emily. So the first decade that you looked at, for the 60s, 1967, what was the signature of the recipes that you looked at? I mean, what did you find?
So the 60s were really interesting. I found a lot of kind of gross recipes, honestly. So a lot of them would consist of like gelatin, mayonnaise, cream cheese.
All together?
Yes. So I have spoken to some of my Southern friends, and they'll tell me their grandmother makes something like that, and it's actually really good. So
what was it called?
I think sometimes people will call it ambrosia.
Okay.
But
the nectar of the gods. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
It's still, I mean, my friend sent me a picture of ambrosia salad from Publix the other day. So it's still around. Yes, okay. Still around. I read an interesting article, though, when I was doing research for my thesis about the use of gelatin in the households in the 60s.
Okay.
So a lot of women, and this is where the gender dynamic comes in, after World War II, you obviously have kind of the rise of like the domestic housewife. And so in the 60s, 50s and 60s, a lot of women were looking for easier recipes, but still wanted to be able to impress their husbands and their children. So gelatin kind of gave them the chance to do that.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So that this ambrosia was struck you as kind of old-fashioned, and that they're trying to bring it into a post-World War America. And that's quite a common recipe in the 60s, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So you see a lot of it.
Yeah.
Okay. What else do you see in the 1960s?
There's in the July issue in 1967 was probably the most telling. There's a whole section about barbecue, which could go on and on about Dr. Simmons in his, I took his Contemporary South class, and we had a whole unit on barbecue.
Few people know more about barbecue than Matt Simmons, I can tell you that. So there's barbecue in there, right?
Yes.
And what's it saying about barbecue?
It kind of frames barbecue as a Texan thing, which is interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
not southeastern North Carolina, South Carolina.
Right. And they also, rather than saying, because again, a lot of this information, I've talked to friends and family that are from the South about this. So barbecue in Texas is usually brisket. So when you say Texas barbecue, you're talking about brisket. And then like Carolina barbecue is pulled pork.
Right.
So they talk about barbecue as more of a verb.
Oh, okay. Right. So to barbecue something.
Right. So it's really interesting. And just in this particular article, they talk about chicken, pork, and beef.
Okay. So they're your two principal signatures for the 1970s, right? Ambrosia, barbecues, anything else they're trying to make Southern as a taste, right? Because, I mean, what we're dealing with here is kind of gustatory taste. What you eat is also a value of who you are. And so in the 60s, they're saying to barbecue, Texan, ambrosia, anything else they're trying to make Southern.
The 60s, I think, are, at least in my research, they were kind of, for Southern living, a standalone decade. Okay. There's not much explicit Southern mention for the recipes. A lot of it is just like quote unquote easy weeknight meals or make this for your next potluck. So again, like there's a lot of chicken recipes, but they all include mayonnaise and cream cheese.
Mayonnaise and cream cheese.
Yeah, right. So it's...
Yeah, and this gelatin, ambrosia thing. So as an historian, you're really interested in placing these things in context, right? So what's happening in the 1960s generally is going to help us better understand why they're eating these particular kinds of foods. So how did you contextualize what you found for the 1960s? Right.
So the 1960s are a very tumultuous decade. You have the Civil Rights Movement, you have the assassination of JFK, MLK. There's a lot going on, Vietnam War. And so what I found in Southern living, or at least the way that I contextualized it, was there's no mention of the political situation in the United States. I think I found one article in the 67 issue about what you can make to send overseas to Vietnam soldiers. But other than that, it's a very optimistic and happy tone that's being presented. So it's kind of just a contrast to what's going on in the United States. It's, the South as an oasis from this political hellscape that is occurring.
And that's really interesting to me because the South has often played that role in times of national crises, right? So immediately after the Civil War, the South is a place to escape to. Even before the Civil War, it was a place where Northerners who were harried by the industrialization could find a kind of soothing, composing atmosphere. And it sounds to me that you're saying that the 1960s, a very tumultuous decade, full of political strife, Southern living kind of frames itself as a kind of comfort food, right? Yeah. That's very interesting to me, a kind of counter-narrative. All right, so the 60s, comfort food in a time of strife. So the next year you look at is 1977. What do you find as a proxy for the 1970s? What did you find for the 70s?
So in the 70s, it's really interesting. You see a rise of, I guess, quote unquote, ethnic food. There's a lot more Tex-Mex included. Okay. There's a lot more Asian-inspired food included. And what I kind of interpreted this as was, I looked at census data to look at immigration patterns to the U.S. South. And there's an influx of Latin and Asian immigrants to the South, especially in the 1970s. So we see these recipes being influenced by what I would believe to be immigration.
And so Southern Living is picking up on these immigration patterns and incorporating that cuisine into Southern food? Or was it saying, hey, this cuisine is now becoming Southern food, or is it just in the South but not of the South?
It's hard to say. I mean, they don't really explicitly say that until I think it was the 90s. Okay. So another way I interpreted it was, yes, they're acknowledging this influence of Latin and Asian immigrants, but you also have to look at the gender dynamic again, which is, this is suburban housewives trying to fulfill their domestic duties by making interesting weeknight meals, not just making pot roast. They want to have taco night for their kids.
Gotcha. So there's a kind of cosmopolitan quality, right?
Right.
Which has always, again, been part of Southern identity. I mean, based in fact, has always been quite cosmopolitan and connected to the Atlantic world. And so you're seeing this being reflected in the 70s. What about the 80s? Similar?
80s are very similar to the 70s. So there was not much change from the 70s until 2017. And even then, it's not a stark difference.
So a lot of continuity. Correct. Over 40 years?
Yes.
Okay. Anything curious about the 80s or the 90s?
So one thing I did find in the 80s was there was a slight decrease in the amount of those ethnic inspired recipes, which I kind of related to the rise in conservatism in the South in the 80s. You obviously had Ronald Reagan as president, and kind of have what we would consider republicanism is really emerging at that time. And so a lot of it seems to be more focused on the white South.
And what kind of food does that reflect? Or is reflected in the recipes? What kind of stuff?
So I saw a lot of corn, cornbread.
Okay, cornbread, all right, yeah.
Still a lot of chicken. And I'm trying to think what else. I mean,
does barbecue make another appearance that's not Texan, or is it largely Texan?
So there was some, I believe in this, either the 70s or the 80s, there was a barbecue article, but it was barbecue sauces. Barbecue's never really presented as a regional thing in Southern Living, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm curious about what's missing that people would expect to find in Southern Living, right?
I didn't see collard greens at all. Which
remarkable. Remarkable.
Another thing, I mean, there's a huge noticeable Latin and Asian influence, but there's really very little explicit Black influence, which you can interpret one of two ways. You can say they're leaving out Black influence, or Black food is so tied to white Southerners because they've been living alongside each other for centuries that it's something that you can't really even separate at this point.
They've already incorporated it into African American cuisine is Southern cuisine, right? But they're not saying that explicitly?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. So you're seeing lots of continuities between the 70s and, you finished this in 2017.
Right.
What are some of the changes that you detected, if anything? Because again, context changes, right?
Right. So I would say, and I say this in my thesis, that 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2007 are very, very similar. There's a huge presence of Tex-Mex and Creole food.
Okay.
And it isn't until 2017 that I think it starts to maybe change a little bit. And I contextualize that as the 2010s being almost parallel to the 60s. There's a lot of upheaval in the 2010s,
Sure.
Especially from a racial standpoint. And I didn't find it so much in the recipes, but I went on Southern Living's website and I found kind of their mission statement and a little bit about them. They make a point to say we basically, we welcome everyone. We want to make sure that we're celebrating diversity. There's even a little tidbit that says we've gone back and taken recipes out that don't honor that culture's authenticity.
Interesting. Do you know what they're talking about when they said that?
I mean, I don't know the specific recipes, but there are a lot that I could probably
Ambrosia,
relate
maybe?
that to. There was one in the 70s, I believe, that was it was like a make your own fiesta night.
Oh, right. So insensitive thought.
Yeah, and so it's funny because just none of the food is like authentic.
Yeah.
They had like gazpacho, which is a Spanish dish, not a Mexican dish. So
yeah, a bit more frivolous than not taking
Right.
it seriously. Yeah, sure, I get that. Okay, that's interesting. I'm just curious. Beyond, as you're reading these things, did you get a sense of sub-regionality? That is to say, is Southern Living saying real Southern food is largely Southeastern, it's a Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia thing, or is there more of a Western emphasis? And I ask that because of this Texan appearance early on, which, well, obviously the Texas is part of the South. It's not the first place people would think of usually as Southern, right?
Right.
I mean, where's the emphasis in this magazine?
I mean, I would say it's if you look at the volume of recipes, a lot of them are Tex-Mex inspired. At least when you're looking at these like standout articles.
Yeah.
But overall, I think the magazine does a pretty good job of reflecting the diversity of Southern recipes.
Sure.
And so it's not only Tex-Mex, it's not only Creole. They also have some articles about these are Carolina favorites. I think there's like an upcountry cooking section. So, I mean, it's hard to say like what they're trying to do here, but after looking at, I guess it was 6 decades, I can probably say that they, in terms of Southern cooking, they are doing their best to reflect the diversity of the South.
The changing composition of the South is being captured in the kinds of recipes they're publishing. Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Anything that pops up about restaurants, because I mean, one of the great developments in the past 15, 20 years has been the explosion of Southern cuisine in restaurants. Do you see that reflected? I mean, stuff that you wouldn't make at home, but you'd go out to eat.
Yes, okay. Yeah. There's one article about 4 chefs in, I believe, one of the 1977 issues, and it's about Southwestern cuisine. So I think they're all Texas chefs. One thing I found really interesting about that is they were all white and they were all men. So we see like chefs being predominantly male, whereas the domestic recipes are being sold to women.
Yeah.
And then the Southwestern idea of like, I think it's interesting because these are more like haute cuisine restaurants.
Right.
They're kind of making traditional Southwestern cuisine more fancy.
Do you see an appearance of the Charleston restaurant scene or the New Orleans restaurant scene?
At least not in the issues that I looked at. Charleston, honestly, is largely absent.
Is that right?
Which is interesting.
I think the absences are revealing as the presence.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay, well, let's kind of give it a long arc. Did you, as you were reading these recipes, were you inspired to replicate any of them?
Yeah, there actually, I mean, there were a few. I think there was one that wasn't really like distinctly Southern that I just thought was interesting. It was like a raspberry, like pound cake kind of thing. I thought that was interesting. There was also like a bourbon ice cream that I thought would be good.
That does sound good.
The ambrosia salad, not really.
Was that probably the least appetizing thing you read?
I do kind of want to make it just to see.
I would like to see that. I mean, I'm very curious about that.
Some of the like chicken recipes that called for 3 cups of mayonnaise, not so much.
Do they put a name to that? The 3 cups of mayonnaise with chicken? What they call it?
I don't even remember.
Joy.
Honestly.
Just Southern joy.
Yeah.
Right? Wow. Anything that struck you as really tasty though? Like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah. I mean, there was one like country breakfast article. So they had like grits, they had ham, biscuits, which sounded
like a Cracker Barrel kind of feel
sorta,
to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see why that's quite seductive. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share with us, Emily, about this research project and what people can take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to fit into even a 20-page paper.
Yeah.
There's just so much going on. You have obviously the political background of what's going on in the U.S. You have the racial and ethnic dynamic. You have the gendered dynamic. There's also the subject of class that we didn't really even touch on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think overall it just really speaks to how the South is presented and how it's perceived. And again, like the South in this magazine is often presented as kind of an oasis, as a haven from everything that's going on, from all the angst and political upheaval. And yeah, I mean, it's very layered and it's very nuanced, but overall it just reinforces this idea that the way that we perceive the South is heavily influenced by media.
Yeah, absolutely. So the media, taste, all these things got to make Southerners up, right? If you were, let's say you had another 2 years to expand this, what else would you do?
I think I would really like to look at the other sections of Southern Living. I'd like to kind of look at the travel and leisure sections, see how tourism in the South is operative here, because I think there could definitely be a lot of connections to the food.
Sure.
And that can just give us even more insight to what the South really is in terms of a larger national context.
Yeah, I think that'd be really interesting. I think it'd also be interesting to compare a non-Southern magazine, right? So,
right.
But I bet you, my gut tells me that they're using food in similar ways to accents kind of sub-regionalities.
Right.
But ultimately, I suspect that Southern food makes its way into national cuisine precisely because in Southern Living, they're speaking about the diversity of diet, right, and the diversity of taste. So perhaps the South isn't just the South. It might be even an American diet at some level.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating thesis, Emily, and I really enjoyed working with you on it, and I learned a lot, and I suppose that's ultimately the purest expression of admiration from a professor. Emily Ames, thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you for having me.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.